So, in the recent spirit of wrapping up some series that I left a little bit open-ended years ago, it's now time for part 3 of the Development of Carriers series. As previous videos, although I will forgive you if you haven't seen those, it's worth noting that we are going to be following the development of the fleet carrier in its various guises, and so escort carriers will need their own video at some point, and since most light carriers or light fleet carriers were conversions, most of them won't be covered here. So for the purposes of the series, we're generally defining a fleet carrier as having needed to be designed as a carrier from the keel up, since in this part of the series we're looking at World War II, so we're pretty much past the era of big conversions, with the exception of if this is a nation's first attempt at a carrier, then a conversion is forgivable. The carrier must also be capable of approximately 30 knots or more unless there is a very, very good reason for it. And they must be designed to carry at least 36 aircraft, i.e. at least 3 squadrons. So from that you'll derive that something like the Hio class, being large but conversions, won't be covered. And similarly, Shinano is a conversion, Seydlitz is a conversion and also not the size of a full fleet carrier, but we will take a quick look at Graf Zeppelin and Italy's first 2 attempts, although whether or not Impero was ever going to be converted is a subject for another video. And similarly to the Destroyer Development series, since this is about their history and development, not so much about their combat record, we won't really be touching on the combat record of the ships all that much unless it directly pertains to some particular point about their design. So, starting off, we have the Germans. German planning for an aircraft carrier actually goes back a fair way. There was a desire for some sort of carrier all the way back at the start of the 1930s, when the Navy decided it initially wanted to try and free itself from the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. However, because of that treaty, Germany hadn't actually built any carriers. They also hadn't built any during World War I before the treaty, partly due to the strategic confinement of the High Seas Fleet, and partly due, at least in the First World War, to a heavy reliance on Zeppelins. And since military aviation as a whole had been banned by Versailles, building an aircraft carrier would have been a bit pointless in the 1920s anyway. This meant that when Admiral Raeder eventually managed to get an aircraft carrier approved as part of his vision for a future fleet program in the mid-1930s, the Kriegsmarine could only really rely on general ideas of what a carrier was, combined with visits by their naval attachés to other nations' aircraft carriers. The initial aim was for a ship designed for operations in the North Sea and the Baltic, and so the first sketch that was drawn up was for a ship of around 10,000 tons, operating between 25 and 30 aircraft. But as plans for naval warfare expanded out into the Atlantic, initially focusing on the Marine Nationale, so too did carrier ambitions. A carrier capable of Atlantic operations would have to be larger, not just so that it could have decent seakeeping, but also so that it could have enough fuel to have the correct amount of range. It would also be operating entirely beyond the range of land-based aircraft. The previous concept had toyed with the idea that the carrier would be supported by long-range land-based strike aircraft, which would give it more of an escort and fleet defence role, primarily loaded down with fighters. The new ship would instead have to also support heavy strike missions, as well as the reconnaissance and fighter cover roles. Thus, the new design that was sketched up increased tonnage to 15,000 tons, and called for the construction of 3 ships so that at least one would always be operational. It was at this time that the demand for a large secondary battery was made. This would be made up of guns of up to 150mm in caliber, in compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty and London Naval Treaty restrictions on aircraft carriers, and the demand was made largely on the principle that the Kriegsmarine would likely be smaller than any navy it fought, and thus every ship had to be capable of multiple roles. In this particular case, it meant that the carrier, which might have limited or no escorts, could need to defend itself, or, alternatively, it should be able to have the ability to attack commercial shipping with the guns if weather or other restrictions made the use of aircraft impossible at that moment, or just to finish off ships that the aircraft had crippled. In the meantime, the Germans had been making sure that their new wave of naval attachés were getting as much information from informal conversations and ship visits as humanly possible as they went around existing carriers in other navies. Particularly helpful were a series of technical exchanges with the Imperial Japanese Navy, which, after some initial roadblocks, would include extensive information and tours aboard the carrier Akagi. Now, at this stage, the Germans were still trying to stick to the Anglo-German naval agreement, and thus they were basing their overall carrier tonnage on a percentage of what they thought British carrier tonnage was. But it turned out that they'd overestimated the displacement of the various British ships, and so having thought they had 45,000 tons, and therefore 3 15,000-ton carriers, they now realised that their allocated percentage was actually just over 38,000 tons, and therefore it was quite clear that 3 Atlantic-capable fast carriers split between this tonnage, which would have resulted in each carrier displacing a little over 12,000 tons, was pretty much impossible. Instead, they changed plans again, with a pair of carriers displacing just over 19,000 tons. Armour, speed, and firepower were all increased from the 15,000-ton design to compensate. The air group, thanks to having a larger ship, would now be 45 to 50 aircraft. And it was at this stage, in the continued quest for more firepower, that the guns, that being the heavy guns, were moved down from their initial position in turrets on the flight deck to casemates in the hull, although sources are divided over whether the doubling of guns at this stage was down to a desire for more firepower, given that unlike the turrets, the casemates could only come to bear on one broadside, or, as per other sources, somebody getting slightly confused after receiving orders to double the number of casemates relative to turrets due to moving from twin turrets to single casemates, but then also getting separate orders to generally increase firepower, and so going, oh, okay, we're going to double the number and barrel count of the casemates, resulting in the extremely heavy secondary battery. This overall design was to be the basis of Flugzeugträger A, or Aircraft Carrier A, which was laid down on the slipway that had just been vacated by the hull of the battleship Gneisenau. The increase in firepower and protection had dropped the air group down to around 40, but speed was still supposed to be around 35 knots. Standard displacement, however, had slipped upwards a little bit, and eventually projected full load displacement was going to end up around 34,000 tons. But various shortages in things like materials, manpower, and critical elements such as machinery would dog the building process, leading to delay after delay after delay, and thus the eventual cancellation and breaking up on the slipway of the minimal amount of material that had been gathered for the second carrier, Flugzeugträger B. It didn't help that some of the delays were simply because shipyards in Germany were unfamiliar with the details of building a ship like an aircraft carrier, as opposed to the more regular gun-based warships. A priority was also given at a state level to other ships that could be completed considerably faster, as apart from the actual shipbuilding issues, there were also problems getting an air group together. The air group problem was partially due to Goering insisting that anything that happened to fly belonged to the Luftwaffe, no matter where it was, and partially because of the creation of a bespoke aircraft, the Fi-167 torpedo bomber, combined with the conversion of Bf-109 fighters and Ju-87 dive bombers, was also subject to delays because their development was somewhat tied into the projected in-service date of the ship, which kept slipping. For the Fi-167, it meant moving staff back and forth to and from the project as the new deadlines progressively stretched further into the future, since, of course, the Fieseler Corporation had other work it could be doing in the short term, and there were similar issues in the Messerschmitt and Junkers factories, complicated in their particular case by the delays also seeing an advance in the subtype of those aircraft that they were building for the land-based forces and from which theoretically they would derive the sea-based variant. For example, when the first orders came in to develop the BF-109T, the carrier version, the BF-109B was the latest version. By the time work on the aircraft carrier, which was by now named Graf Zeppelin, was finally stopped in 1940, the 109 had reached the E3 and E4 variant models, and the development program had therefore used a number of different progressive models of 109 to test carrier-specific equipment, and of course each of those would have slightly different performance levels. Another problem was a growing realization that fully loaded adapted BF-109s and Ju-87s would only really be able to launch with catapult assistance. But the air reserves for said catapults wouldn't actually be able to launch half of the aircraft on the ship before they needed quite a lengthy recharge cycle, which put something of a dampener on these aircraft's development. Almost immediately after work was paused, though, there were a series of carrier operations against ships in port, such as Taranto and Pearl Harbor, as well as carrier strikes on ships at sea, like the attack on Bismarck, and this persuaded the Germans to try and restart work on the ship in 1942. But that also meant developing new aircraft, since the previous designs were now considered obsolete and had largely been sent off to fight the Russians. But then the Battle of the Barents Sea saw work on all surface vessels largely stopped again by the end of the year, and in Graf Zeppelin's case this was never to restart. She was theoretically scuttled at the end of the war, but then salvaged by the Soviets as she wasn't in particularly deep water, and ultimately, as it turns out, used as a target by the Soviet Navy a couple of years later in their ongoing efforts to understand how to sink aircraft carriers, which by the beginning of the Cold War they were very, very interested in doing. Next up, the Italians. Similar to the Kriegsmarine, all the way back since the 1920s, the Regia Marina's senior officers had been debating the utility of aircraft carriers. Their main naval rival was France at the time, and it was generally thought that Italy's limited resources would probably be better utilised in the construction of more traditional warships. After all, given France's relative proximity to northwestern Italian land aircraft bases, it was thought the Regia Aeronautica could probably reach anywhere that would actually matter in a war, even at sea, and their existing bombers and the forecast ones seemed to have an appropriate amount of range. Although a seaplane tender was converted from a merchant ship, both for general testing of aircraft at sea and also to support the aircraft that were installed on the fleet's cruisers and battleships. Thus, Italian plans for aircraft carriers were generally put on hold for most of the interwar period in favour of spending the resources on the modernisations of the older Cavour and Duilio class battleships and the construction of the new Littorios. But by the time Italy fully entered the Second World War, it was quite clear that France was not going to be involved in said conflict for all that much longer, and that meant the Regia Marina would now have to worry about the Royal Navy, who not only had aircraft carriers of their own, with which to maintain fighter defences of the fleet against Regia Aeronautica bombers, which would probably be unescorted, but the Royal Navy was also based in Gibraltar and Alexandria, considerably further away than all but the largest, and therefore least precise, Regia Aeronautica aircraft could actually reach. This, of course, prompted renewed interest in aircraft carriers for the Regia Marina, an interest that was understandably only increased when the British used but one of their carriers to attack the Italian fleet at Taranto, damaging a number of battleships. A few plans had been made for the conversion of the liner Roma to a kind of support carrier, but these events prompted this to be further refined into a full conversion to a fleet carrier. Unfortunately, the relationship between the Regia Marina and the Regia Aeronautica was about as fractious as that between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, and the Regia Aeronautica initially insisted there was no aircraft in its inventory suitable for carrier operations, and moreover there would not be one for quite some time. But then the Battle of Matapan happened, and the Regia Marina used it to point out that, well, if they'd had a carrier, they could well have seen off the handful of British torpedo bombers that had ultimately caused the loss of 3 extremely expensive heavy cruisers, and further, it allowed them to point out that the Regia Aeronautica had been about as successful in providing air cover for the fleet as modern fast food pizza restaurants have been in setting up in Italy. This caused Mussolini to turn around and inform the Regia Aeronautica that they would find some aircraft for the aircraft carrier, or else. And so work recommenced. Given the short time they had to get the ship into service, the Regia Marina decided to take the design that had been done for the conversion of the Roma in 1936 and try to make as few adjustments as possible, having used the relatively brief Regia Aeronautica imposed pause to refine the design somewhat, and they also rather rapidly sent a few of their officers up north to see what the Kriegsmarine had done with the Graf Zeppelin and if there was anything they could learn from that. As the Regia Aeronautica began a crash course in folding wing aircraft, they suggested in the interim the RE-2000 was perhaps a suitable stand-in aircraft, since there was already a catapult-launched naval version in use on Italian surface warships. But although planned air groups were drawn up, the RE-2000 was quickly dropped as the RE-2001 was soon deemed suitable for both fixed-wing operations and potentially a folding wing variant later on, and was, as the title suggests, a slightly more advanced fighter. It also had the advantage of being capable of being used as a torpedo bomber with relatively little modification. If a small deck park was used and a few more aircraft were hung from the hangar ceiling, a total of 51 RE-2001s might be carried, and perhaps more if the folding wing version became available and therefore the aircraft used up less deck space. Since, however, there was already a battleship named Roma about to enter service, the liner Roma was renamed to Aquila, or Eagle. The ship would need brand new machinery, since in its liner configuration it was only capable of 20 knots and the Regia Marina wanted to go to up to 30, and so they just grabbed the machinery of two cancelled Capitani Romani class light cruisers for the purpose. The hull also needed to be bulged to improve stability with all the extra top weight, and to add some torpedo defences. There was just over 3 inches of armour fitted to the magazines and the fuel tanks, and defensive armament would consist of 8 single 6-inch guns, although this would later be changed to 8 5.3-inch guns mounted in pairs on hull sponsons, and a mix of 88mm or possibly 90mm, depending on your source, and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, at least under initial proposals, but partway through the conversion, this plan was replaced with another plan which called for 12 single 65mm guns mounted on sponsons, and then no less than 132 Breda 20mm autocannon mounted pretty much anywhere space could be found, in a series of rather interesting sextuple mountings. The island continuously expanded as various minor design revisions were made, and in its final form it included a large number of the light anti-aircraft guns as well as an early Italian radar suite. But then things began to stall, as regardless of the fact that work on Aquila was already slowing down due to a lack of skilled manpower, another conversion, the Spaviero, was begun, and of course this meant the small workforce available had to be split between the two ships, and the estimated completion date for Aquila slipped from October 1942 to July 1943. Then, in November 1942, she was somewhat damaged by bombing and had to be moved to what was supposed to be a safer port. At the same time, Operation Torch forced a redirection of Regia Marina resources from an offensive role to a somewhat more defensive proposition, and so by June 1943, only some of the ship's systems had been tried at all, and sea trials were pushed back again now in September. But near the end of June, almost all work was stopped as there was a need to redirect manpower into submarine and escort construction for more close-range scenarios. By August, although the hull and the machinery was almost complete, the flight equipment and the anti-aircraft batteries were still nowhere to be found, and relatively few aircraft had been converted for use. And then the Italian armistice in September 1943 finally put an end to any marginal work that was still being done, and the ship was promptly looted for useful equipment by the Germans, after which she proved to be something of an anomaly, since she was targeted by Italian frogmen, Allied bombers, and German troops, all in various efforts to sink her for one reason or another, but all these efforts failed, and she was recaptured in 1945 with little more to show for the past 2 years of relative abandonment than a slight starboard list from minor leakage and, of course, the looting that the Germans had done. So she was moved to a quiet part of Genoa harbour for a while the new Italian government tried to work out if they should continue with her conversion, but eventually they decided to scrap her in the early 1950s. Now, the other serious Italian carrier attempt, we've already mentioned briefly, the Spaviero, she was actually a near sister to the liner Roma at the beginning, and work on her would begin only a few months after work on the Aquila. At first, it was proposed that she should be named the Falco, but that was quickly changed again to Spaviero by the time the year was out. Her conversion was intended, due to the later start, to be far more austere, and theoretically, therefore, she should have been completed even faster than Aquila. Originally named Augustus, her stern was left largely in place, and so the flight deck, unlike on Aquila, would not have been full length. The diesel power plant that limited her to around 20 knots was also kept, and just ducted out either side of the ship. And with a single hangar, her air group would have been reduced to around 3 dozen at best, compared to Aquila's double hangar. But, apart from cutting down the liner's superstructure, pretty much nothing else had been done before Italy bowed out of the war, and she too fell into German hands. Unlike Aquila, she was sunk in an attempt to block access to Genoa harbour in late 1944 by the Germans, but that wasn't a particularly successful attempt, thankfully for all involved. That brings us to the Japanese, and here we're going to look at the 2 kinds of full fleet carrier that they actually managed to build, and one general design series they didn't quite manage to get around to finishing. First up, we have Taiho. Japan had initially wanted a modified version of the Shikaku class, which was their new gold standard for aircraft carriers, but their doctrine, and thus the design, began to change rapidly in the late 1930s and early 1940s. In part, this was a result of a series of Japanese war games. Like both the American and British navies, the Japanese concluded that there was a relatively high chance that a strike that found an aircraft carrier would be able to hit the aircraft carrier and at best disable it, at worst sink it. But like the Royal Navy, they therefore concluded the best way to deal with this inevitable strike would be to armour against it, as opposed to disperse the fleet, which was the American approach. But unlike the British, the Japanese had also shed all pretense of adhering to treaty restrictions. So, unlike the illustrious class, which sacrificed air group in exchange for heavy protection, the Japanese decided that they could build a ship that was heavily protected and still would be capable of mounting a large strike group of its own. They'd just have to build a very big ship. As the latest generations of Japanese carrier aircraft came online and the Japanese began to realise that they actually had a significant range advantage against the publicly stated figures for the American and British fleets, it also set out a prospect for a possible doctrinal shift for future Japanese carrier operations, where a force of heavily protected carriers could form a forward group which could find, fix, and then initially strike enemy aircraft carriers. This would, of course, provoke a response, but this armoured carrier force would be able to defend itself from incoming counterstrikes via both its combat air patrol, and then, if any strike aircraft survived that and the anti-aircraft gunfire, they'd be able to tank the relatively few hits from bombs that made it past those measures. This would then allow the other half of Japan's aircraft carrier fleet, which obviously had somewhat less protection, to hang further back, out of range of enemy strikes, but within range of their own aircraft, and then using the information from the forward group, they could muster an overwhelming strike force, which could be launched completely unimpeded, and would in theory arrive over the enemy fleet just as it was recovering its own aircraft after strikes on the frontline armoured Japanese carriers. This would ensure maximum destruction on the enemy fleet. This rather radical set of requirement changes meant that it would take 4 years between the first submission of drawings for what would eventually become Taiho to the laying of her keel in 1941, with various lessons also thrown in at the last minute from observations that were being made about carrier warfare conducted in the early part of the European theatre. At just under 30,000 tons standard displacement, she was a big ship, and featured an enclosed hangar, but not one with armoured sides, which was British practice. She just had an armoured flight deck. Although, due to the slightly hodgepodge nature of her design process, it was decided not to repeat her specifically, but instead to build a number of successors to a somewhat modified design, which would be a little longer and heavier and carry some more anti-aircraft guns, at least in their initial sketch phase. She herself had 2 hangar decks, but once again, the rapidly evolving nature of the design meant that once she was fully loaded, the lower hangar deck was only barely above the ship's waterline, and that would be a critical aspect of her loss soon after commissioning. She was also designed to carry and operate the latest Japanese naval aircraft, which of course were generally speaking larger and heavier than previous types, and so she needed larger and more powerful lifts, a need that was increased even more by the lack of most of these aircraft having full wing folding. Although she was supposed to carry a pair of catapults to allow the early launch of the most heavily laden strike aircraft, the systems in question weren't actually fully ready in time, so she entered service having to launch fighters first and then strike aircraft as more flight deck length became available, although they did also experiment with rocket-assisted takeoff, although that had, shall we say, mixed results. Unfortunately, one of the other compromises made in the constant design revisions was the placement of the aviation gasoline tanks right underneath the lift wells, and since obviously the lower lift position had to have the lift deck flat with the lower hangar deck, it meant the well that lift sat in went below the waterline, and thus when she was hit, the combination of the aviation gasoline tanks right underneath combined with that low lift well and the low height of the hangar meant that gasoline from the ruptured tanks came up to sit in said lift well in the forward lift, which then merrily vaporized, petrol vapors all through the hangar decks, even as the crew tried to do anything and everything they could to get rid of the fumes. And then one bad choice with the ventilation system was all that it took to turn Taiho into a fuel air bomb of monstrous proportions, and the inevitable spark somewhere set it all off, spelling the end of the ship and also leaving the Japanese with a rather inconvenient fact of having all these new highly advanced strike aircraft and no carriers whose lifts could actually handle them. The other Japanese fleet carrier program that at least had some ships constructed during the Second World War was the Unryus. Now, these weren't, as is sometimes claimed, war emergency designs slapped together in the aftermath of the Battle of Midway. Design work had actually begun before the Pearl Harbor attacks, but it is fair to say that the design was influenced by knowing that war probably wasn't very far off, and so the Japanese Navy would have to go for a larger number of fast-to-build and theoretically fast-to-replace aircraft carriers, as opposed to their gold standard Shikaku or derivation thereof, which they would have ideally liked. The program had its origin with the second and third Vincent Acts in the USA, which called first for a 20% increase in US Navy strength, and then latterly the Two Ocean Navy Act, to which, of course, the Japanese felt they had to respond. Since they knew they had to build ships quickly, as mentioned, they decided to walk back from the Shikaku Gold Standard, and instead decided to develop a carrier that was based off the Hiryu class, which were somewhat smaller. But there was a reason the Japanese Navy had advanced beyond the Hiryu class in the first place. They'd actually proved somewhat more complicated and difficult to build than had originally been thought, and with new large heavy strike aircraft coming into service, they were actually relatively small. And so, as well as work on what would become the Unryu class, separate work on a brand new clean slate design was started, with the Unryus being viewed as essentially a stopgap measure. Where the idea that the class was slapped together after Midway comes from is partly thanks to the Battle of Midway, The Japanese Circle 5 and then revised Circle 5 plans, which were their naval expansion programs, were thrown into chaos by said battle, with a series of changes made, which saw the initial call, which would have been for Taiho derivative carriers to be built, being gradually superseded by more Unryus and less of the Kai Taihos, until pretty much the Unryus were all that were left. But this was a change in build priority, not a development of a new design at that point. The final program that came out left Japanese industry with a target of producing another 14 carriers. Reflecting standardization and more advanced practice as more information had come in, the Unryus would have their islands on the starboard side only. Previous Japanese classes had paired ships, with one ship having a portside island and one ship having a starboard island, at least initially when construction began. Obviously, single ship classes like Taiho are excluded from this. This meant, for example, that there wouldn't be abandoned support structure taking up unnecessary weight, as had happened with Hiryu and Soryu. To maximise deck space, it was called for the bridge island to be as small as humanly possible, with the only requirements being a basic bridge, aircraft direction facilities, a Type 21 radar, and rangefinders for the anti-aircraft guns. If they could fit light anti-aircraft guns on some of the wings, then that was fine, but it wasn't particularly necessary. And there was also a call for some bullet and splinter-proof armour plate to be installed to keep everybody alive in case the bridge got strafed. The funnel was trunked directly downward and away from the flight deck, although in the interests of compactness, some of this trunking was incorporated into the aft end of the island. In light of the newer, larger aircraft coming into service, aircraft elevators were reduced from 3 to 2, but the 2 remaining ones were made bigger and stronger, so that they could lift heavier aircraft, but also get them up onto deck faster, thus partly making up for the loss of throughput capacity by the elimination of the 3rd elevator. In a change with previous Japanese doctrine, which was to arm aircraft in the hangar and then bring them up to the flight deck, the lifts for ammunition were also extended all the way up to the flight deck, so while you could arm aircraft in the hangar, you could also take aircraft up unloaded onto the flight deck and load them there, which would again speed up operations. From this core design, there would be a series of continual modifications, both while the ships were having final design finalized and while the ships were under construction, which was based on feedback from wartime experience. This would include things like better ventilation, in light of the loss of Taiho, the installation of foam-based fire suppression systems, and a significant reduction in flammable materials present aboard. Torpedo defences were generally increased, and armour was generally decreased, as it turned out that no Japanese carrier was lost to surface gunfire, but quite a number of them were either lost or severely imperiled by aerial and submarine-launched torpedoes. But these constant design changes, as well as wartime shortages, meant that the exact specifications of each Unryu class carrier were often slightly different from the ship that preceded them and the ship that would succeed them in construction. For example, they wanted to use high-pressure steam power plants as found in the Shikaku and Taiho classes, but they had to settle for using a simpler, slightly less powerful power plant that was found in the Hiryus, Soryu, and Megamis. That 152,000 shaft horsepower power plant was supposed to give the ships a top speed of 34 knots, but it proved difficult to come by even that in a wartime environment, and so, amongst other ships, the Amagi and Kasagi would be fitted with a somewhat heavier machinery set, which was available from the then under construction Ibuki class heavy cruisers. Katsuragi and Aso were forced to take power plants from destroyers that were under construction, and for the Ikoma onwards, which was about halfway through the production run, they just decided to use Ibuki-style machinery again, but with a lower pressure, allowing for the reduced use of strategic materials, and a simplified layout, which probably would have forced them to have 2 separate funnels rather than one heavily trunked one. By the time they got to the Ikoma, with Unryu, Amagi, Katsuragi, Kasagi, and Aso having preceded it, they decided that so many changes had been made compared to the initial Unryu that Ikoma onwards were actually listed as a subclass, variously called Ikoma subclass in English, but in Japanese was usually referred to as either Kai Unryu, or advanced or improved Unryu, or Kai Hiryu, which is improved Hiryu, reflecting that although a lot of changes had been made, they were still fundamentally, at their core, a Hiryu type design. In addition to having a similar layout of 5-inch and 25mm anti-aircraft guns as the Hiryus, they were also supposed to have a number of 4.7-inch anti-aircraft rocket launchers installed. These rockets used a variable time fuse with the idea that when they reached their point of detonation, they would scatter incendiary and shrapnel payloads in a manner similar to the Type 3 anti-aircraft shells used on Japanese battleships, and these came in 28-cell box launchers. But as the war went on, it became clear that the latter ships would never be completed in time, and so they were cancelled, and a number of ships under construction were also either cancelled because they wouldn't be completed in time, or had work abandoned partway through due to shortages. In the end, only 3 Unryus were actually completed: Katsuragi, Amagi, and Unryu, with Kasagi almost completed. Katsuragi would be used as a repatriation transport post-war before being scrapped. Amagi was sunk by airstrikes while in harbour and was then refloated and scrapped, and Unryu managed to get herself sunk by USS Redfish, as it turned out that carrying large numbers of the Oka or Cherry Blossom kamikaze missiles and being set on fire by a couple of hits from American torpedoes was not a particularly good combination, and unsurprisingly, she exploded rather spectacularly. And that leaves us briefly to cover the G14 and G15 types. The G14 can be crudely described as a super Taiho, or more accurately an improved Taiho, because that's what Kai Taiho means. Essentially it was Taiho, but supposed to be able to support as many aircraft as a Shikaku could, which meant that the design had to be upscaled to somewhere between 45 and 50,000 tons, which would put it on a par, size-wise at least, with the considerably later designed Midway and Malta class aircraft carriers, which we will cover later on. The relatively sketch nature of this particular class can be seen in the fact it's not even entirely known whether it would have had an island, as some designs called for one, other designs called for it to be primarily flush-decked with a little retractable island for when aircraft operations were not being undertaken. The G15 is the other flavour of Kai Taiho, or improved Taiho, and was a somewhat less ambitious ship than the G14, which I suppose to a certain extent due to its size could be seen as a super Taiho. The G15s were the slightly modified and improved Taiho type design we mentioned earlier, at about 30,500 tons standard, which was only about 1,000 tons more than Taiho. Most of the weight actually went into improving protection and armament and making the ship fractionally larger, but overall air group didn't actually change all that much, since the newer, larger aircraft were turning out to be even larger than they thought they were going to be when Taiho was designed. One of the things the Japanese Navy really liked was that the slightly expanded hull could fit the 16 dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns that the Shikakus had carried, which was something of a sore point as the Taiho class had had 4 fewer at only 12, which they thought was less than ideal. As with the Unryus, there would be ammunition hoists all the way up to the flight deck, and a basic radar suite. The Battle of Midway pretty much killed these ships, as they would take longer to build than the Unryus, and so it was decided to switch focus to them. The Japanese did look at small cheap carriers towards the end of the war that were more akin to the Independence class in the US Navy, but very little work was done on those before it was clear that pretty much any large ship laid down would never be completed before the war was over. American fleet carrier construction, much like their destroyer construction, was limited to relatively few classes, in this case essentially one when it comes to full service during World War II, but they didn't let that get in the way of building so many that you'd be forgiven for thinking they'd built multiple classes. This is, of course, the Essex class, the main star of the carrier warfare show. Hornet had been ordered as a stopgap, but the US Navy was already well aware of the Yorktown class's design limitations, and they were rather eager to get on with work on something that wasn't designed to comply with the Washington and London Naval Treaty restrictions. But at the same time, when work on the Essex class design began, they were aware that war clouds were gathering even for the USA, and so the Essex would not be an entirely clean slate design, meshing together some new ideas with some proven design concepts from the Yorktowns, as well as other designs from sketches that had been made for larger carriers during the treaty period, when they'd looked at having fewer larger instead of more smaller ships. And this would result in an overall very capable ship, but one that still had a few legacy holdovers, which potentially could be seen as weaknesses. Initial planning for CV-9, the ship that would become USS Essex, was supposed to reflect a London Naval Treaty Limited ship, just a bit bigger than Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet, but in short order a series of congressional acts added 10 carriers instead of just one to the build roster before the Pearl Harbor attacks. They would add 2 more shortly after said attacks, and in total the Essex class would be authorised for a total of 32 ships, of which 24 would actually be completed. With the final collapse of the treaty system becoming obvious, the design for CV-9 now focused around essentially one simple measure. The standard aircraft group that the Yorktowns had been designed around, 90 aircraft, had been reduced between design conception and the ships coming into service because newer, larger and heavier aircraft had been brought into service. The design for the Essex was supposed to maintain at least this ideal 90 aircraft group, if not more, but it was to be designed with a large amount of breathing room such that the 90 to 100 aircraft could be supported with current generation aircraft and the projected next generation aircraft, and possibly even the one after that. There was clearly no way to do this on the originally allocated 20,000 tons, and so the whole design began to grow rather rapidly, although at the same time, because these were needed in large numbers, some space-saving measures were undertaken even as displacement grew. For example, on the Yorktowns, you had 5-inch guns on the port and starboard galleries. These cut into the flight deck. While there was not a huge amount that was to be done with the port side guns, the starboard side guns were instead moved to twin mounts on either end of the island. Now, this did take up deck space in those areas, and as a result, the island was slightly reduced in size. But overall, as the cut-ins from the starboard gallery were filled in, the overall impact on deck space was actually favourable. The reduction in island size meant that things like the pilot's briefing and ready rooms had to be moved to an overhanging gallery space underneath the flight deck overlooking the hangar deck, and in the end the displaced facilities took up so much space that the ability to store aircraft, or at least spare parts for aircraft, in the hangar ceiling, as had been done on earlier US carriers, was somewhat reduced. Lower down in the ship, however, magazine space and storage for aviation gasoline was significantly increased, starting out with a specification for 200,000 gallons and ending up with capacity for between 230 and 240,000 gallons with a baseline Essex by the time the design was finalised. 3 elevators were included for the aircraft, 2 on the centerline and 1 on the portside deck edge, which improved the rate at which aircraft could be brought up for operations or taken back down and stowed afterwards. All of this brought displacement up to just over 27,000 tons standard by the time the order was actually placed for CV-9. Various proposed changes that didn't survive internal discussion were the use of a turbo-electric drive, which was rejected on the grounds that it would take up additional weight and space, which would reduce the amount of volume available for aviation gasoline and ammunition. A double hangar, like found on the British Ark Royal. This was rejected on the grounds that you would be able to meet the air group requirement with a shorter ship, which would then mean you'd have less space for machinery and magazines, or else you maintained the length, or you made even a longer vessel, which would result in actually too much hangar space and therefore wasted volume, but it was also thought, somewhat accurately, that having a double hangar without making the ship completely unstable would mean that each hangar would have to have a lower ceiling height, and that would compromise the future-proofing that was desired for the class. Although, in a slight twist of irony, the physical dimensions of the planned air group in storage were based around the size and weight specifications for 3 designs, one for a fighter, one for a dive bomber, and one for a torpedo bomber. And then it turned out that none of those aircraft actually came into service, and instead you got things like the Avenger and the Helldiver, which of course had slightly different dimensions and weights. But there you go. The conning tower on the Yorktowns was done away with to save weight, but the requirement for high-speed steaming in reverse, which would allow flight operations in the event that one or the other end of the carrier was damaged, added weight back in again. One area where there was an awful lot of argument was armour. There was a holdover from interwar exercises that demanded that the ship should be armoured against 6-inch cruiser gunfire. This used up considerable tonnage and meant that the torpedo defence system could only be somewhat improved over the Yorktowns, whereas ideally the US Navy wanted their carriers to have a torpedo defence system as extensive as that found on battleships. An aspect of this debate was actually an intense disagreement over whether to armour the flight deck or not. A number of US carrier captains were actually heavily in favour of this, but it was ultimately rejected in favour of moving the armour to the hangar deck level, one level down. This was done for 2 main reasons, both of which were related to the protection against surface gunfire. Firstly, the 4-inch thick belt armour had already taken up too much displacement that was allocated for protection to allow for a flight deck that was proofed even against 500-pound bombs, and secondly, the hangar deck armour, because at that point they'd looked at having an armoured flight deck and an armoured hangar deck, but the hangar deck armour couldn't be moved up a level to the flight deck, as this was also obviously the armour deck that was protecting the ship's vitals from incoming shellfire and therefore had to sit on top of the belt armour. If it moved up, then the belt armour would have to be extended over pretty much the entire above waterline side of the ship, otherwise a shell might enter the side of the hangar, which would be unarmoured, and then dive through the various unprotected decks into the machinery and the magazine spaces. And since there definitely wasn't the displacement left in the design to armour the flight deck and the entire side of the ship, and then have to deal with the reduced ventilation to the hangar that would result from closing up the sides, it was decided to leave the whole idea alone. In theory, there was actually weight available in the amount that was allocated to protection to install even a 3.5 to 4-inch thick armour deck on the flight deck, but only if armour elsewhere on the ship was reduced to protection against blast and splinters only, not cruiser-grade shells. With the anti-cruiser-grade protection considered completely immovable, the whole idea had to be dropped. The power plant issue was solved by simply taking machinery used in the Atlanta-class cruisers, doubling it, making a few minor modifications, and thus giving a really nice balance of speed and usage of space, with the Essex class capable of 33 to 34 knots in comfortable conditions. After a few more arguments were cleared up, such as where exactly and how thick the hangar deck armour should be, the keel of the first ship was laid down. Of course, during the progress of World War II, additional and more advanced radar, additional anti-aircraft guns, and various other features would be added, so standard displacement on completion would exceed 30,000 tons for most of the Essex class. Some of this would come from a lengthening of the bow above the waterline, which allowed for the installation of more anti-aircraft guns on the bow without massively compromising the length of the flight deck. But other improvements would include more and better damage control equipment, especially portable equipment, and various other safety features. This was partially compensated for by disposing of a hangar deck catapult that launched aircraft out the side of the ship, Although the installation of a second catapult on the flight deck rather negated the weight saving, even if the space saving was significantly appreciated. Toward the end of the war, there were also measures taken to eliminate a single long ventilation trunk which ran pretty much the full length of the ship, since various incidents like the one on Franklin showed that having a single long passageway for air was great for ventilation in peacetime, but it was also a very good way to spread large amounts of toxic smoke and fumes throughout the ship in the event you had a major fire anywhere near one of the intakes. Although built with some restrictions on size thanks to the width of the Panama Canal locks and the limited time between their being authorised and their keels being laid, and a couple of holdover obsolete design elements like the anti-cruiser armouring, the ships in general proved to be, like the Fletchers, able to accommodate a lot of refits, as well as increased anti-aircraft gun batteries, not just during the war, but on into the Cold War. They were even able to support a series of increasingly ambitious refits to give them angled flight decks, amongst other things, and it would only be in really the mid-Cold War that the size and weight of modern jet fighters moved beyond any realistic hope of their continuing in frontline service, and so the class would mostly be decommissioned and scrapped in the late 60s and early 70s, with the exception of the Lexington, which served until 1991 as a training carrier. 5 ships would survive into the 21st century. Yorktown moved almost immediately into museum ship service upon her retirement. Intrepid and Hornet spent time in the reserves, but survived there long enough to be saved for the same museum ship purpose, and Lexington was moved to museum ship service almost immediately upon her decommissioning. The other survivor in the first part of the 21st century was the Oriskany, which was then batted back and forth for a number of proposed purposes, but she would eventually be sunk as an artificial reef in 2005. But almost as soon as the design sketches for the first iteration of what would become the Essex class had been made, the US Navy was already working on their successors, the Midways. This was in large part because it was easier and faster to build the Essexes, but they were still an iterative design to a certain extent, as we've just discussed. But with that program underway, the US Navy saw an opportunity for a clean slate design that was completely divorced from pre-war concepts, which could address some of the developments in aerial warfare that had taken place at the end of the 1930s and beginning of the 1940s, but also could take into account the experience of wartime carrier operations that the US Navy was, at the time the Midway class program was started, gaining without actually having to be at war, courtesy of observers placed in the Royal Navy, which was, of course, racking up an awful lot of wartime carrier operational experience and was happy to share what they had, mostly in exchange for dockyard space to repair damaged ships. And that, of course, allowed the US to closely examine said ships to learn still further lessons. All of this combined with a relatively impressive performance by dive bombers on both sides in the Norway campaign, even the Skua, as well as further effective use by dive bombers, particularly by the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean, coupled with a number of similar scenarios that had been playing out in the US Navy's fleet problems, and this all led to the idea of an armoured flight deck being the way forward. We've already discussed why they didn't go for that in the Essex class, but with this clean slate design, the US Navy decided that they did want to retain the ability to warm aircraft up while still in the hangar, and they were somewhat underwhelmed by the hangar height and capacity constraints of the British carriers they saw arriving at their docks, which had armoured sides and an armoured flight deck. And so they chose to retain their open hangars, but with the armoured flight deck stuck on top like a particularly heavy but jaunty hat. They briefly considered doing multiple thinner armour decks, which would help a little bit with stability. The justification of this was that a thin armoured flight deck would at least initiate the fuse on a bomb, which would then explode relatively high up in the ship, and the lower armoured decks could then block the incoming fragments. But ultimately, they decided that an enemy who just then changed the fuse on their armour-piercing bombs to a slightly longer delay would defeat that, since the heavy armour-piercing bomb would just go straight through a number of thin decks in that case. And even in an ideal circumstance, you'd still have a relatively large bomb exploding, probably in the hangar, which wasn't ideal. And so a single heavy deck up top was chosen with the idea of just stopping bombs completely outside of the ship. But in a throwback to early 1920s thinking, the fate of HMS Glorious being gunned down by the two Scharnhorsts seemed to indicate that maybe they should bring back 8-inch guns on the carrier in much the same way as the Lexingtons had initially carried. The idea of this being that if the carriers were then used to raid supply lines and attack enemy forces with relatively minimal escorts, since at this point the fast battleships had largely yet to enter service, they would be able to defend themselves against a potential enemy response by cruisers and below with heavy gunfire. They also looked at potentially developing a dual-purpose 6-inch gun for this purpose. However, reports on the effectiveness of radar that were beginning to come in from the European theatre, along with the development of a new 5-inch 54 caliber gun, which would have long-range anti-aircraft and long-range anti-shipping firepower, something that had been lacking in the 5-inch 38, gradually lessened the perceived need for anything bigger than that, since with a decent high-mounted radar, you'd spot incoming heavy cruisers far enough away that you could start to wind up speed to make a run for it, and then you could just use your aircraft to deal with them. And thus it would only be surface actions with high speed and somewhat harder to detect destroyers that would remain a concern, and a 5-inch shell would be perfectly fine for dealing with them. Of the 9 designs considered, CV-E, not to be confused with the escort carrier designation CVE, was selected to move forward. This design displaced 45,000 tons, ran at 33 knots, had a 3.5-inch thick armoured flight deck, and an anti-aircraft battery of 5-inch and 40mm anti-aircraft guns with a 120-strong air group, although it was anticipated that this would drop to around 80 to 90 when bigger aircraft came into service. Rather confusingly, as something of a holdover from the brief dalliance with 8-inch guns, it actually had a 7.6-inch thick armoured belt, which used up an awful lot of weight. The design was just over 900 foot long at the waterline, which made them bigger than even the Iowa-class battleships. But by 1942, the design was heavily revised as there was a pause in construction while there was a big argument over whether a few large carriers or many smaller escort carriers should be authorised that year. And this saw, fortunately, the deletion of that ridiculous armour belt, along with the installation of more light anti-aircraft guns in the form of 20mm Oerlikons, plus an enhancement of the 40mm Bofors armament, and the embracing of many 5-inch 54s. It would be this revised design which was finally authorised at the end of 1942, with 2 ships authorised for keel laying, with a 3rd ship added in May 1943. The first pair were to be named Midway and Coral Sea, which was in keeping with the then current US Navy policy of naming aircraft carriers after battles. But around the time that the Coral Sea was launched in early 1945, President Roosevelt rather inconveniently and inconsiderately died, and his successor, President Truman, decided to change the name of the ship to the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, which started a new US Navy carrier naming tradition. The name Coral Sea was then just kicked down the road to the 3rd ship. The first 2 ships had relatively small islands, but this had a lot of negative feedback, and so the new Coral Sea, which commissioned in late 1947, could be distinguished from her sister ships at first by having a much larger island, although of course all 3 ships would go on to have fairly long and interesting histories during the Cold War, with significant modifications made. Midway is the only survivor of those 3, as she is now a museum ship in San Diego in her very, very heavily modified late Cold War form. And that moves us on to the British. By the end of the 1930s, the Admiralty had taken notice of carriers under construction elsewhere and realised that, as well protected as the Illustrious class were, their air groups were a little bit lacking compared to some of these other vessels. This had led to the 4th ship of the class, the Indomitable, being built to a slightly modified design which expanded the size of the air group by having a double hangar. Originally, the plan had been to build 6 Illustrious class in 3 pairs, But for the third pair, they decided, well, treaty system's gone now, so let's build a new type of ship. Even if, for the sake of speeding up construction, you're going to have to carry over a few design elements. These two ships would be named Implacable and Indefatigable, and the initial specification called for the same armoured flight deck, but boosting air group capacity to 54 from 36, not including any deck parking, and an increase in top speed from 30 knots to 32, maybe even 35 if you could fit it, and somewhat more optimistically, a request to keep the displacement somehow to 23,000 tonnes for cost reasons, but, well, it was almost immediately apparent that that wasn't going to happen. And so the hull was lengthened, the 3-shaft layout was increased to 4, and a larger funnel, as a result of needing more boilers for the greater power output, meant a larger island. But the ships had only just started construction when war broke out, and the long queue of war-damaged ships, as well as the need to divert shipyard manpower to the construction of escorts and other rapidly finished vessels to urgently beef up the convoy protection element of the Royal Navy, meant that construction on these ships was paused almost as soon as it had begun. This pause led to considerably wider changes being made. The flight deck was increased in width, the anti-aircraft battery, which was made up of 4.5-inch guns, was made flush with the flight deck to reduce its impact on flight operations. The aircraft lifts were beefed up, and an early form of catapult was installed to launch slightly overweight aircraft. Although the rough seas of the Northern Atlantic and the North Sea meant the Royal Navy was still holding out against deck parking, it was decided to make some provision for it just in case it became necessary, and so a series of outrigger pylons were installed. These would allow a tail-wheeled aircraft to be stored with only the forward wheels touching the flight deck and a good chunk of the aircraft sticking out over the sea, which would minimise the impact of a deck park on the operational space on the flight deck. A call for slightly increased hangar bulkhead armour, as well as the scrapping of the idea to carry float planes, meant that a decision had to be taken. The original design, of course, called for a double hangar, with a 14-foot high hangar up top and a 16-foot high hangar lower down. But with these design changes, you could either lower the 16-foot hangar down to 14 foot to match the top one, or combine the two hangars into a single very tall American-style hangar, which would enable the storage of some aircraft in the ceiling. Unfortunately for future-proofing the ships, it was decided to go with two 14-foot high hangars instead of one big one. As well as the 3-inch thick flight deck armour and the 4.5-inch heavy anti-aircraft battery, there was also an extensive octuple and quad 40mm pom-pom battery, giving a total of 44 barrels, with additional quadruple pom-poms and up to 60 20mm Oerlikons added to the armament while the ships were under construction. Due to those early delays, the ships weren't actually launched until the end of 1942 and only commissioned during mid-1944, and that meant that they only saw limited wartime service, a few operations off Norway, and then sent to the Pacific as part of the British Pacific Fleet. They did prove capable with deck parking of operating 70 to 80 aircraft at a time. However, thanks to fuel and munitions provisions being based around only the aircraft they could store in their hangars, they needed fairly regular topping up. During these operations, the lower aircraft hangar was generally used mostly as a repair workshop, with aircraft stored on deck and in the upper hangar, with an escort carrier attached to each of the Indefatigables, which would then allow them to supplement or replace damaged or destroyed aircraft pretty sharpish. Although able to operate most aircraft types in the Second World War, the decision to have two relatively short hangars instead of one big one came back to haunt both vessels in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, as the new jet aircraft and the last generation of propeller-driven aircraft were considerably larger, and outside of the relatively diminutive Sea Vampire, they just wouldn't fit. And so after a relatively brief service life, both ships were decommissioned at the end of the 1940s, and it was decided that they should be completely modernised, including angled flight decks and rebuilding the hangars into a single larger and taller one, which probably should have been done at first. But the Treasury decided, in their infinite wisdom, that they were going to try out a general refit program similar to what they wanted to do to the Indefatigables on the smaller Victorious first. That was completely bodged up, and Victorious used up the entire modernisation budget that had originally been intended for 3 carriers, and so instead of being refitted themselves, both Indefatigable and Implacable would be disposed of and scrapped in the mid-50s. The other major Royal Navy carrier building program that actually saw ships commissioned during the Second World War was the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier program, although this ended up being broadly divided into 3 separate classes. While the main American takeaway from the Norwegian campaign was that dive bombers were very definitely important, for the Royal Navy, the main takeaway was high-performance fighters were definitely needed to cover the fleet. But there was a limited number of large fleet carriers, and the ones under construction would take some time to come into service. Someone suggested turning the King George V's into battle carriers, but they were very rapidly kicked out a window, and converting large ships, such as liners and so forth, or perhaps cruisers, was also dismissed on the grounds that cruisers were needed elsewhere to protect merchant ships and to fight the Italians, and the merchant ships were needed to actually move people and cargo in convoys. Also, most of the more easily available merchant ships could do less than 20 knots, which would make them completely unable to keep up with fleet formations. There was also a concern that if you had to duplicate personnel and equipment across multiple very small hulls, perhaps capable of operating only a squadron or 2 apiece, this would be inefficient compared to fewer but slightly larger ships. And so by 1941, this conflicting set of requirements had, rather rapidly to be fair, evolved into what was loosely termed, in Royal Navy parlance, an aircraft destroyer. Now, fortunately, this was not a destroyer saddled with a sad and confused fighter plane aft, but rather it was a name designation in the same vein as the torpedo boat destroyer had been at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, i.e. it was a ship dedicated to destroying enemy aircraft as opposed to doing anything else. But someone very quickly realised there was a lot of potential for confusion with this name, and the scheme was relabelled rather rapidly to fighter carrier, which was a little bit more self-explanatory. The idea was a ship of this nature could keep up with the fleet that was moving at cruising speed, operate an entirely fighter-based air wing, and thus operate quite a number of them, because fighters were smaller than strike aircraft, and, thanks to operating only fighters, it wouldn't need complicated magazine arrangements with bombs, rockets, torpedoes, and cannon and machine gun ammunition. It would just need fighters, fuel, and some machine gun ammunition, or perhaps cannon ammo as newer fighters came online. Such a basic vessel would also be faster and more efficient to design and build from scratch, as compared to taking a perfectly good county-class cruiser, ripping up its superstructure, and ending up with a ship that would have only about half the fighter capacity anyway. The first design to this specification was proposed in early 1942, and thus the whole thing became known as the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier Program. The initial ship was relatively unambitious. The vessel had a 600-foot flight deck, 15 fighters stored in a hangar so low that they'd be scraping their radio antenna, and a 25-knot top speed. A handful of 4-inch anti-aircraft guns were included alongside a few smaller weapons, but these were actually rapidly deleted to allow for the inclusion of a longer flight deck, and therefore just light and medium AA guns, which anticipated the arrival of newer and higher performance fighters. The Royal Navy was so overloaded at this stage with various work that this basic outline was sent over to Vickers with a request to revise it to a final design. They came back with a lot of changes. The flight deck increased to about 690 feet, the hangar height went up from an aircraft top scraping 14.5 feet to a rather generous 17.5 feet, and using the space that was freed up by the fighter-only focus and the now expanded hull, more fuel tanks were included, which would give the ship around a third of the fuel capacity of an Essex type, while ostensibly only being expected to support an air group 1/6 the size. By March 1942, the design was considered to be complete and ships began to be ordered. 16 had been ordered in total by September, of which 2 would be converted to maintenance carriers while under construction, and the last 6 would be completed to a revised design, which would be known as the Majestic class, while the original flavour ships would be known as the Colossus class. The power plant was fairly simple. They took a Fiji-class cruiser's power plant and split it in half between 2 ships. Hence, each ship would have 2 screws and a top speed of around 25 knots. But it was realised that with this much expanded Vickers design, they could carry an awful lot more than just 15 fighters. An air group of potentially 40 to 50 was possible, which was actually more than the on-paper capability of an Illustrious-class fleet carrier that wasn't using deck parking, despite the standard displacement being only a fraction over 13,000 tons, which was about 10,000 tons less than the Illustrious class. Of course, this was partly explained by the complete lack of any armour beyond splinter-proofing, and the smaller machinery plant and thus slower speed. So what you had was a ship that, as long as you didn't let anything hit it particularly hard, was actually a very capable carrier operating a useful flight group and had a build time that was only slightly longer than a particularly large destroyer and actually shorter than a cruiser. Thus, they decided to add bomb and torpedo magazines back in to allow them to operate the full range of aircraft. During the Second World War, the standard loadout of the Colossus class, therefore, would be 21 Corsair fighters and 18 Barracuda strike aircraft, as these could do both dive and torpedo bombing. The Colossus, Glory, Venerable, Vengeance, and the Pioneer, which was one of the maintenance ships, just about managed to reach the Pacific in time to technically claim to have taken part in the Second World War, with all the other ships following post-war. Although they were only expected to last a few years, essentially to the end of the war or until someone got a bomb hit in, they actually went on to be some of the widest and longest serving carriers of all time, with various members seeing service in the course of their careers with the Royal Navy, of course, but also with the French, Dutch, Argentine, Australian, Brazilian, Canadian, and Indian navies, with 2 of their number, the Vengeance and the Hercules, surviving into the 21st century as the Brazilian Minas Gerais and the Indian Vikrant, respectively. The Majestics differed from the Colossuses mostly by having a stronger flight deck and more powerful aircraft lifts for the newer and heavier aircraft, as well as increasing aviation fuel storage, having somewhat better accommodation, and even, believe it or not, limited air conditioning, but otherwise were the same basic design. The following year, the Admiralty initially planned to just order more Majestic class, but the type represented pretty much the limit of what you could accomplish with the original Vickers design, and it was thought, rather intuitively, that aircraft were going to get even heavier, and particularly heavier than the 1942 design could possibly be reasonably made to accommodate. And thus, a revised design was needed. The hull was expanded to accommodate the anticipated bigger aircraft without compromising aircraft group size. The flight deck was strengthened yet again to support an aircraft weighing up to 13.5 tons, and with an increased hull size, you would also have more ammunition capacity, since of course a newer and bigger, more powerful aircraft would be able to carry more and larger weapons. To move all of this around required more machinery, and so a different power plant was adopted. This time, half the power plant of the Audacious class fleet carriers was used, which is the class we'll come on to next. This allowed the new design to move at just over 28 knots. This ended up creating a light carrier that was actually slightly larger in overall dimensions than an Illustrious class fleet carrier, although it would displace around 500 tons less. With this capacity came the appreciation for the need for at least some protection. Extensive subdivision and splinterproofing was done internally, and an inch of steel was included on the flight deck, which gave protection against at least high explosive weapons, as well as also helping with the whole flight deck strengthening system. 8 ships of the newly dubbed Centaur class were ordered, with the intention that these would form part of a new carrier fleet alongside the Malta class, as the Audacious class was already being curtailed in favour of the new large Maltas. However, with the subsequent cancellation of the Malta class and the end of the war, 4 of the 8 ships were cancelled, leaving the Centaur, Albion, Bulwark, and Hermes to be completed. The last of which originally was named Elephant, but was then renamed on the stocks when the original Hermes, which was supposed to have been the lead ship, was cancelled. That, of course, had been named in honour of the first Royal Navy proper aircraft carrier, HMS Hermes, which had been lost early in the war. Although anticipated to serve post-war, these ships would go on to, once again, have a much longer service than even the Royal Navy thought possible. Centaur and Albion lasted until the 1970s, Bulwark just about made it into the 1980s, and Hermes, of course, famously went on to fight in the Falklands War and was subsequently sold to India at the end of the 1980s, becoming the Virat, which only went to the breakers half a decade ago at the time of this video's being published. The very last fleet carriers the Royal Navy built in World War II, although didn't quite finish, were the Audacious class. Now, something that people don't necessarily always appreciate about the Audacious class is that these are effectively the Royal Navy's Essex equivalent, as US and UK carrier development tended to be slightly offset. So, for example, the Royal Navy built Ark Royal, the US Navy then built the Yorktowns shortly thereafter. Then the Royal Navy built the Illustriouses and the Implacables, which were followed by the Essexes, and then the Audaciouses slightly followed the Essexes, with the Essex and Audacious classes representing the respective navies' first tries at non-treaty restricted carrier designs. The Audacious class grew out of the same building program for 1940 that had seen the 2 Implacable class evolve out of the Illustrious class. The program called for a 3rd ship in 1941, and since there was a little bit more time available, they decided that since the Implacables were somewhat of an iteration on the Illustriouses, well, why not iterate further with this new vessel? But by the time 1941 rolled round, it was quite clear that the work they'd done had essentially created a brand new class, and detailed design work on what was supposed to have just been a slightly larger Implacable with 4-inch thick deck armour and 2 hangars was cancelled, and a completely new design put together instead. Whereas the Implacables had been designed around the maximum weight of a fully loaded Albacore torpedo bomber, the new carriers were designed with the idea that the lift should be able to take an aircraft that would weigh as much as 2 fully loaded Avengers. And speaking of the Avenger, knowledge of the existence of this US aircraft and the fact that the Royal Navy was shortly to buy some of them meant that the hangar height was specified to be considerably taller, rising to the 17.5 feet that was found in US carriers at the time, as opposed to the 14 feet that had been accepted in the Implacables. Remarkably, with this additional hangar height, they still managed to retain the double hangar arrangement, although it meant that the ship went up to around 38,000 tons standard displacement and just off 50,000 tons at deep load, with the upper hangar being about 400 foot long on an 800-foot flight deck, and the lower hangar being somewhat smaller at just 172 feet long. Although 4 ships were laid down in late 1942, wartime shortages and conflicts of various building programs, such as emphasis on the light fleet carriers as they were faster to construct, meant that the first hull wasn't launched until 1946, and thus none of the ships would see action in World War II. Although 4 ships had been specified, the arrival of the even larger Malta-class design specs almost immediately after the keel laying for the first of the Audacious class meant that the last ship of the class, HMS Africa, was reordered as a Malta-class carrier, and then thanks to Royal Navy aircraft carrier losses in the first half of the war, the names planned for the ships were swapped around. So the Royal Navy never actually got HMS Audacious, as she was launched, but she was renamed to Eagle before commissioning. The second ship was named after the lost HMS Ark Royal, and the third vessel, which was now presumably to be the Audacious, was cancelled at the start of 1946. Due to their long construction time, a number of wartime lessons were incorporated, with things like the location of the lifts being changed to allow for a separate section of the hangar to be used as a maintenance area without interfering with the movement of aircraft to the flight deck. Of course, additional radar and even more anti-aircraft guns were also installed, and as with the Essex and Midway classes, they could initially operate over 100 aircraft, at least in theory, depending on the balance of the air group, but by the time they actually entered service, the introduction of newer and larger aircraft meant this had dropped to around 80, and as the trend continued during the Cold War, the air group would drop to 60, then 50, and then eventually down to 38 by the time they were operating F-4 Phantoms. Thanks to both hulls being completed after World War II, Eagle, the first to complete, was the only one to actually complete to a straight flight deck design, which was roughly speaking what had originally been envisaged, whereas Ark Royal was delayed post-war, then extensively modified, and so when she was finally completed, she was the world's first carrier completed with an angled flight deck instead of being refitted with one. Eagle would then be refitted in the early part of the Cold War, leapfrogging the Ark Royal, but it was planned to replace both of them with the CVA-01 class carriers, but they were then cancelled, which meant Ark Royal in turn had to be refitted, which amusingly enough, together with the mutilation of 2 Tiger class cruisers, ended up costing the Treasury more than it would have cost to just build the 2 CVA-01s in the first place. Eagle was denied a refit and was taken out of service in 1972 as a source of spare parts for her sister ship, finally going to the breakers 6 years later, and Ark Royal was kept in service until the end of the 70s and then sold for scrap in 1980. This brings us to the last ship we're going to look at, the Malta class. Much as the Audacious class, you could say, are roughly a British equivalent of the Essex class, at least in terms of contemporary design, the Malta class were approximately the design contemporaries of the Midways. While the mid-war Royal Navy carrier construction program was dominated by the Audacious and Light Fleet carrier programs, it was realised rather quickly that larger ships would probably be needed going forward, and so in 1943, final detailed design was started on a new generation of fleet carriers. So urgent was the perceived need for these ships that 4 vessels, the Malta, the Gibraltar, the New Zealand, and the Africa, which was the reordered Audacious class, were ordered in late 1943 with materials supposed to be gathered up immediately, despite the fact that the final design hadn't actually yet been completed. This was largely due to an argument as to what kind of flight deck to adopt. Did you go with the previous Royal Navy practice of an armoured enclosed hangar with the armour on the flight deck? Did you go with an approach with an armoured flight deck but open sides, the latter being the more American practice? Or did you go with the American style design as seen on the Essexes, with all the armour terminating at the hangar deck level? The first of the supposed final designs, Design X, was actually a little bit bigger than the Midways, at about 60,000 tons, but had an Essex-style unarmoured flight deck, but a very thick armoured hangar deck. It also tried to go for the best of both worlds by having an enclosed hangar forward to keep the sea out, but the aft section open to allow the warming up of aircraft before sending them up to the flight deck. An interesting element of these final design revisions was that previously the Royal Navy had built carriers to what they thought was the best balance of size and cost, and then aircraft specifications were issued to fit the carriers, whereas the Maltas were designed around a hypothetical 30,000-pound long-range strike aircraft, and so the carrier had to fit the aircraft instead of the other way round. But Design X was seen as slightly too long for the majority of Royal Navy dry docks without significant expansion work being done to them, and so X1 was prepared, only marginally smaller at 897 feet long. The hangar was 17.5 foot high, like on the Audacious class, but it was decided to go with one long hangar rather than a slightly shorter upper hangar and a very short lower hangar. By this point, the relative experiences of British and American carriers against kamikazes in late 1944 and early 1945 had become apparent, and there was a sudden shift in design choices, with emphasis going back towards having an armoured flight deck. But since the whole programme was already running behind schedule, it was decided to lay down the first 2 carriers hopefully revise the design of the second two carriers, and then use those design revisions to hopefully change the first two carriers while they were under construction. With a projected air group of 108 of the new improved jet and last generation propeller aircraft, the whole project was then cancelled at the end of 1945 as part of post-war austerity measures, as the Admiralty had been persuaded that the Implacables, Illustriouses and Audaciouses could be modified relatively easily to accommodate new jet aircraft and incorporate angled flight decks, which was especially attractive since, in the Implacables case, they were only a few years old and the Audaciouses hadn't even quite been finished yet. But it turned out to be one of the most wrong assumptions in the history of naval construction, and in hindsight, it actually turns out that just scrapping those three classes entirely and building the four Maltas to the revised armoured flight deck design would have given the Royal Navy a more capable and cheaper carrier fleet going into the Cold War. Given what happened to the Audaciouses, it's highly likely that the final revised armoured flight deck design would have been drawn up, with probably all the ships on hold in the late 1940s, completing in the late 40s and early 50s, and thus likely being completed like Ark Royal was historically, with angled flight decks from the get-go. And that, of course, would have avoided the debacle of the Victorious refit, and probably also meant there was no need for a CVA-01 program in the 1960s, and possibly seen large Royal Navy carrier air wings being operated all the way through into the 1980s, with potentially interesting knock-on effects for potential late Cold War successor class. But we'll never know that, and with that we wrap up our rather extensive video covering World War II fleet carrier designs. Thank you very much for listening.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.